if consciousness is fundamental, most people have this idea that then the physical world is not real, or is a projection, or is a hallucination or something. And I don't see it that way at all. And I really am a physicalist in this sense. I think the things that we perceive, the things that our brains map out for us, space and time and color and all of the things that we're able to perceive, obviously many, many things we don't perceive and they just kind of wash through us. The things we're perceiving, ultimately, at bottom, what all of the matter is, are felt experiences arising and passing away in the universe.
Annaka, welcome. Such a treat.
Thank you. It's so great to meet you.
Yeah.
Be here.
I've been looking forward to this conversation, but with actually a slight degree of apprehension too, to be honest with
fair.
you.
Yes.
Largely because conversations about consciousness can be really tricky to have.
Yeah.
And I think Alan Watts put it this way: you can't bite your own teeth.
Right.
Yes. So trying to shine a flashlight back onto the flashlight has inherent difficulties in it. And sometimes I can feel like I'm in a three-legged race with myself. So if I get clumsy.
I think everyone who touches the subject feels that way.
Yeah. So maybe just we can start with some definitional work to scaffold the conversation so people can follow the thread. So how have you become to understand consciousness, and what are perhaps some of the different ways that people understand the concept?
Yeah, so I worked with neuroscientists for 20 years, a little more than 20 years. Let's see, I'm kind of starting, I'm getting ahead of myself. I should say that what my work now focuses on, what my audio documentary is about, what my book Conscious was about, the thing that I'm obsessed with and can't stop thinking about, that I think is deeply mysterious, that I would love for the world and human beings to understand better, is kind of consciousness in the most fundamental sense. So usually when we talk about consciousness, especially in neuroscience, we're usually referring to a complex form of consciousness. We're talking about human consciousness, usually some level of self-awareness, of complex thought, that type of thing. But what I'm interested in and what I think is deeply mysterious is a much more basic thing, and it really is just the fact of felt experience, the fact that it would feel like any collection of matter at all. And that doesn't need to entail self-awareness or thoughts even at all. So, there's some debate about whether certain insects and worms are conscious, with neuroscientists, but we don't know, and we can easily imagine, or maybe not so easily, but we can imagine that insects have some level of what I'm referring to as felt experience, as sentience. And sentience can be described as a susceptibility to sensation. So kind of almost like a bare awareness that can have some type of flavor content to it, just the simple feeling of pressure. I often give the example of a worm or of a snail, and if we imagine there's some felt experience, an experience from the inside of what it's like to be that system, I would imagine that it must entail some form of touch, maybe some form of registering heat, temperature, but very amorphous, probably very little memory, probably no sense of self, really. Obviously no thoughts. There's not that kind of complexity to their brains or central nervous systems. And so when I become curious about how it is that certain configurations of matter in the universe have this other dimension of felt experience of what it's like to be that matter. That seems deeply mysterious. It can't be explained yet by neuroscience. I'm not sure that it can ever be explained by neuroscience, which is kind of how I went down this path.
Is that the hard problem?
That is, yes. And that's often referred to as the hard problem of consciousness, which comes from David Chalmers, the philosopher. I think he's now at NYU. And he wrote a paper and then a book in the 90s and kind of popularized this idea, which is wonderful. It's actually the first place I encountered this idea was how is it that any collection of matter in the universe ever begins to have a sense of feeling what it is to be that matter from the inside. And that is the hard problem. And it's called the hard problem because the so-called easy problems in neuroscience, which is a joke because nothing in neuroscience is easy, but those problems are things where we understand. That's where we're making a lot of progress in neuroscience, is how are the things we feel related to what's happening at the level of the brain. And we have a better and better sense of that, a better mapping of what parts of the brain are responsible for what types of feelings, what types of behaviors. So those are the easy problems. But the hard problem is why any collection of matter, any system in the universe would have an experience from the inside. And so, one example that makes it very vivid for people is just our experience of seeing, right? So we understand scientifically that when we see, it's because light waves are hitting our retina and then getting processed by the brain, and then the brain kind of creates this experience of seeing blue, of seeing yellow, of seeing shape. And those properties of, what I experience when I see yellow, that property of yellow does not exist out there in the world. It's being generated by my brain. And there are other systems in the universe, like cameras and computers, and many, many plants. Plants have more photoreceptors in their bodies than we have in our eyes. And so there's a lot of processing that takes place in the universe of light waves that affect subsequent behavior. They get processed in different ways, that get distinguished from one another. That information is used in a variety of ways where we have no intuition that those processes are conscious. And so we don't expect a computer, a camera, or a plant to be generating an experience of seeing in those circumstances. And so why is it that some systems have an experience like that associated with their processing and others don't?
Yeah. It's interesting that you lump in a computer or a camera with a plant, given that one seems to fall into the taxonomy of organic and one perhaps inorganic.
Yeah.
And there's a fascinating whole section in Lights On about plants.
Yeah.
And I was also a fan of Susan Simard, I think is her name.
Suzanne Simard.
Suzanne Simard, yeah. Who did this wonderful study in British Columbia around essentially how Douglas firs and other species of trees essentially exchange through mycelium networks carbon and water and nutrients, and even some sorts of protection mechanisms against blight.
Information, there's memory, and it's fascinating.
And it violates our intuition there, right? Because trees and plants are sessile and not mobile. They don't seem to qualify for quote-unquote consciousness because we tend to thrust the limitations and the wonderful aspects of our own nervous system in a sort of anthropocentric sort of way onto our understanding of consciousness.
Yes.
So I guess I would ask you, in terms of where you are right now, would you attribute consciousness to a tomato plant?
Yeah. So the reason I put all of those things in the same category, computers and cameras and plants, is because most people, and I include myself in this category, most people assume they don't have a conscious experience. And so those are all processes. And I like to include, animate and inanimate examples, but all of them, we very easily intuit them not having consciousness. So there's a difference between how human beings and cats and dogs are experiencing the world and plants and man-made systems. Some people have different intuitions about plants, and it makes sense. I mean, they're closer to us than a camera in terms of how they're made, and actually learned
DNA
a lot.
And
yes,
stuff,
yes. And I learned a lot in this one chapter that you referenced. I talk about it in my book that came out in 2019 too. But I had a lot of fun diving into this research because the behaviors of plants is much more complex than I ever realized, and that most people realize. And some of this research, is as recent as 2014. There's new stuff coming out all the time. And so, some people definitely have intuitions already that maybe there's some level of conscious awareness in plants. It's counterintuitive to me, so I like to use that example. I also like to use plants for myself in a variety of different thought experiments because they're similar enough. I mean, our brains are sharing information, through neurons using electrical information, and plants are doing a similar thing in lots of instances. DNA, we share DNA with plants. And so there's enough similarity that we could imagine maybe. There's kind of a question mark there. But it can shake up my intuitions in the way that I like to for this work. I talk a lot about breaking our intuitions, shaking up intuitions, distinguishing false intuitions from ones that kind of give us more accurate information about the underlying reality. And
if you subscribe to panpsychism, for example, and you...
Oh, I remember your question now.
Go for it. Yeah,
it's okay. So you're asking whether I think at this point. Yeah. At this point, I mean, you're at the end of my documentary, so you know that I think it's more likely than not that actually consciousness is part of all matter in the universe, that it underlies everything, essentially. I don't believe that. I just think it's more likely than not. And that's where I landed after 5 years of doing this research and conducting these interviews. So that means that actually anywhere you find matter in the universe, you would find a conscious experience. That sounds crazier when I say it in one go. Yeah. It takes 11 hours of my documentary to convince you that that's not as crazy as it sounds.
You don't come across as remotely hysterical on tape. You. Well, let me just splice that a tiny bit, because there is this kind of notion of idealism, right? That where consciousness is kind of fundamental, sort of sits behind everything, and matter is essentially a projection within consciousness, and then there's kind of a slight shade of difference between that idea and panpsychism, and in which we attribute consciousness more as a property, right? To essentially everything
world
that takes form in the universe.
Maybe.
So I wonder,
I definitely have moved. So my view is it's closer to idealism than panpsychism at this point. I would say it started closer to panpsychism and then moved closer to idealism. I don't subscribe to either of those. I mean, the way I think about things doesn't line up perfectly with either of those, and never really has. And I have issues even using those terms for a variety of reasons that I talk about in the documentary. I don't think we understand yet how consciousness fits in to our picture of the universe. I don't think anyone knew thousands of years ago. I don't think we know now. Maybe I'm wrong. But I think between the years and years of introspection and contemplative work that people have done and the progress that the sciences have made, I think I think it's now a totally legitimate and very important question for modern human beings and modern science to be asking, which is, one, is consciousness more fundamental than the sciences have previously assumed? And two, is it the fundamental thing? Does it actually go all the way down? And so my experience in talking about panpsychism and idealism is that it makes it difficult to have the conversation now, because at least the way I'm interested in thinking about it, the way I'm interested in pursuing it, I'm also embedded in the sciences, and I believe in the sciences.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine.
And I'd like to match what we believe with the evidence and everything that we've learned.
Well, this is the great conundrum, because there is very little measurement device for consciousness, right? Because you require consciousness to measure it.
No, and this is one of the interesting things about it. One of the things that makes it so mysterious is you cannot get direct evidence of conscious experience but for being the conscious experience.
Right. Well, I sometimes conflate it to a mystical experience, kind of the transformation of the sensation of feeling like a separate self to the feeling of being completely interwoven into an integrated universe.
Yes.
Yeah, we try to find vocabulary to describe that transformation, but it always comes up a tiny bit short. I mean, the poets can give us a glimpse on a good day.
Although also what I love about where science keeps leading us is in that direction as well. It's like the more we understand about the forces and the particles and what the universe is, the more we understand, the more it looks like an interconnected universe of essentially everything made of the same ingredients. And it does place us as part of that universe. We are part of kind of the unfolding of whatever the universe is. We're not in it. We're not visiting here. We didn't come here as separate selves.
Yeah,
we are it.
Yeah, we grew from it.
And so I think science is heading in that direction too, and it's part of the reason why I find it so psychologically and spiritually rewarding to focus on these things also. But I wanted to go back to one thing that you said about idealism. One thing that I have a problem with is they are isms. And so they kind of give this sense that there's a fully formed set of beliefs, that there's something you could subscribe to, that the answer's already there. And I think we clearly don't yet have the answer. And we're just at the beginning of this very exciting exploration. And so I resist it because I think it just kind of gives the wrong impression. I think, as I said, I think the thing I've been convinced of is that we can ask this question now, and it's just a question. So there's no belief set to subscribe to. I think they also just have an aesthetic problem. I think especially panpsychism, honestly, just is a word that sounds like a New Age word. It sounds like it came from the time it did come from, which was the 16th century, when human beings just did not understand the world around them. And so I feel like there's kind of a lack of confidence, especially in the scientific world, if you use those terms, because they just don't matter. Those were human beings who came up with those ideas, had no understanding even of our solar system, right? And so I think it's important to bring this conversation into the present. And I'm not sure there's anything that's so useful about those schools of thought that are so essential to be addressing now. There are also some conclusions that panpsychism and idealism come to, depending on the interpretation, that I completely disagree with and I actually think are not useful and are not part of my view. And so at this point, after I've spent all these years writing and working on this, and kind of coming up with, it's not so solid, but coming up with an idea of what I think the universe looks like if consciousness is fundamental and what types of questions I think we should be asking, scientific questions. Those other types of conclusions, I think, are incorrect and kind of get in the way. And so one thing you said about idealism is that, mind is primary, the universe is consciousness, and the physical world is a projection. And that's the way I think many idealists would describe it. And I don't think that's the right way to look at it at all if consciousness is fundamental. And I think that's not a useful way of looking at it if we want to ask interesting questions about understanding consciousness better and its structure and why things seem the way they do. So the way I would describe that, and I'm kind of getting to the very end so we can walk ourselves back here, but I didn't want to lose that piece you brought up about, if consciousness is fundamental, most people have this idea that then the physical world is not real or is a projection or is a hallucination or something. And I don't see it that way at all. And I really am a physicalist in this sense. I think what the physical world, the things that we perceive, the things that our brains map out for us, space and time and color and all of the things that we're able to perceive. Obviously, many, many things we don't perceive, and they just kind of wash through us. The things we're perceiving, ultimately, at bottom, what all of the matter is, are felt experiences arising and passing away in the universe. And so consciousness isn't creating a physical world. The physical world is how, from a human mind, and maybe from other types of conscious perspectives, from one conscious experience's perspective on another, how the interaction between those two parts in this structure appear in any given system. There's
so many different thoughts that are emerging as you're talking about that. I'm thinking sort of like compatibilism between determinism and free will, not necessarily as pertaining to those topics, but it seems like you found your own compatibilism on some level between kind of a more physicalist approach and an idealist approach. insofar that you're not denying that matter exists, right?
Yes.
I mean, you can...
No, it's just what matter is. And what's interesting is where fundamental physics has led us is, we thought the atom was the smallest thing, and we get smaller and smaller.
Down.
and when we don't actually understand what matter is yet, and there are all these beautiful and fascinating theories, and from string theory, M theory, to all the newer ones that people haven't heard about yet. Some of them I explore in my series. We don't understand what matter is yet. And one thing that I'm curious about and that I ask a lot of these scientists about is, if it turns out that consciousness is fundamental, is that actually helpful in what we're seeing in quantum mechanics? And I'm asking this question in a very different way than it's usually asked. I don't think the fact that observation, the way it's talked about in quantum mechanics, plays a role. I don't come at it from that angle, and I don't find that interesting, and I actually don't even agree with that interpretation of quantum mechanics, that you need a conscious observation. I think it can be explained much more in physical terms, in terms of interaction between micro and macro systems. Obviously, if consciousness is fundamental, then it plays a role as well. Yeah.
Can we hover on that just for a second? Yeah. Because there's obviously these famous kind of double slit experiments, right, where consciousness seems to have great influence on matter itself, or the behavior. Measurement does. Okay, fair.
Yeah. Some people think it has to be conscious measurement. Most physicists, I would say, at least most physicists I know, would not say that. They would just say measurement.
Right.
That whether or not we ever know about it, or it's observed by a conscious mind, once it's measured, that
it collapses the wave function.
Yes.
Yeah. But you don't use...
And I'm in that camp, yeah.
Yeah, but you don't necessarily stand atop that concept as a support system, as a scaffold for idealism.
Not at all, no. And in fact, I don't take that view. And I really came at this from neuroscience. What was interesting is I became more and more interested in consciousness, and then became more and more aware of not only how little we understand it from the side of neuroscience, but also how most of the modern breakthroughs in neuroscience actually chip away at our intuitions about what we always thought consciousness was, and why we make the assumptions that we make.
One of the questions that I kept asking myself as I was listening to Lights On is whether it is a light on or off, or if the light is on a dimmer.
Sure.
And I get, you probably understand what I'm getting at, but just to be clear, does consciousness exist essentially across a spectrum? And can it be mapped onto evolutionary biology to some degree, where, okay, there was like a supernova that exploded and vomited its guts all over the universe, and 8.5 billion years ago, we're going to go very, very fast now. 4 billion years ago, it kind of cohered into an Earth-like planet. And then, of course, there's like microorganisms and bacteria, and then bacteria had a tryst and created chloroplasts and mitochondria, and it led to multicellular life. And then, of course, woodpeckers and bears and megafauna and you and me and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That was a very quick 8 billion year history. But across, I guess what I'm getting at is, across that history, did consciousness, can you map an evolution of consciousness? Or no, it was always there.
Yeah.
But humans just seem to be at the apex of that journey now. Okay.
Yeah.
Pause.
So it's possible that consciousness emerges at some point in the universe, either in life or in some sort of complex processing. That's been the assumption of the sciences this whole time. It was actually my assumption for most of my career. I've been convinced that doesn't make sense. And first I will say that however deep in nature consciousness goes, and whether it's fundamental or not, I have never seen consciousness as a spectrum in that sense. And so what I think is a spectrum are the contents of consciousness, of the types of things that get experienced. I see consciousness actually as binary, which is why one of the reasons why the series is titled Lights On. Yeah. And I just believe there is no off. There's no such thing as off. I shouldn't even say I believe that. I'm convinced that makes more sense than the alternate view that we have tended to have in the sciences, which is that it comes on at a certain point. But either way, I think there's clearly a spectrum of what can be experienced. So again, if we go to, let's say single cells can experience something, or worms or ants, their Umwelt, the types of qualia they experience at that level, is clearly not only different, but much less than a human brain. And even within the human brain, I mean, we can undergo anesthesia, we can have moments of very dim awareness. I think, yes, they can be more and less complex. They can have many, many more elements to them. If we had 10 more senses, there'd be a lot more going on. But I think consciousness itself, the thing that I'm calling consciousness, that I'm interested in, the thing that seems deeply mysterious about this element of the universe, is that any felt experience happens at all. And so there's kind of this spectrum of content, but going from, if there's such a thing as no consciousness, if there's actually no consciousness associated with the atoms in this chair, at some point, as you said, you kind of describe this, single cells come together, then, whatever it is, then a brain develops, and at some point, a felt experience comes online. However minimal that is, you go from nothing to something. Mm-hmm. And that is a binary step. And so it's not just a spectrum. If it emerges at some point, you come off the spectrum at some point. And we have to explain, which is one of the things that got me so interested in this, what does it mean and what would it require, at the level of chemistry, at the level of biology, at the level of neuroscience, for there to be atoms, non-conscious atoms, right, and then certain point and the lights come on.
Go on.
And that actually doesn't, I think, make a whole lot of sense. It's totally possible. I think I keep forgetting what number I put it at, but at the end of my documentary, I think I'm like 60-40 or something like that. So it's not like I've been convinced, but I think it makes a lot more sense for consciousness to be part of the fundamental story. There are also, as I said, reasons in neuroscience and all the breakthroughs we've had, a few things, to believe that a lot of our intuitions about consciousness are incorrect, but also just the simple fact that because conscious experience can only be known from the inside, we are always relying on memory and reportability. And those things are there aren't very many of those in nature. I mean, even, human beings can communicate with each other. We can communicate on some level with our dogs and our cats. But even the communication there has been cut way back. And so the ability for something to give us evidence that there is consciousness present kind of disappears very quickly in nature. Mm-hmm. And even within each other, between each other.
In some aspect, we're limited by just the innate limitations of our sensory instruments to kind of, I'm thinking of this like Roald Dahl essay or short story. It was called The Sound Machine, I think it was called, where there's a main character in it. It's a wonderful story. And very different than what we know him for, actually. Okay. And there's a scientist that has a theory that roses feel pain, and they actually scream, but the frequency of that sound wave is above the capability of our instrument. There was a show or a movie about this. And so he creates a machine that actually can sense, detect that level of frequency. And so when his neighbor is like clipping, the roses, there's this scream. Right. Okay? Right. So, and so
I'm not worried about that.
I know you're not worried about it, but do you think that we have a sort of limited view of attributable consciousness because we are essentially our visible light is between 400 and 700 nanometers, et cetera,
Well, so I'm excited. I'm glad that you asked this question because part of my answer is about where I think the future of science might take us, which I think is very interesting. But a couple of things I'll say. First is, yes, to your question, but not only that, we are the most complex systems we know of in the universe. The human brain is the most complex system. We have a stream of memory. There are some things that happened in my life that I don't remember. And I can only report on the things that are in my stream of memory. There's some research that your audience may or may not be familiar with called the split brain research in neuroscience. So there was a procedure developed for epilepsy patients to prevent seizures from spreading to the whole brain, which then becomes much more dangerous to the person experiencing them. And so they developed this procedure where they split the corpus. They split the right and left hemispheres of the brain down the corpus callosum. Normally, the left and right hemispheres of the brain communicate constantly and are connected. And in these patients, they were split in order to prevent the seizure from spreading from one hemisphere to the other. It worked very well at helping these patients with their seizures. It also had very little noticeable difference at first and people are able to navigate their lives very well and speak, and you don't notice much of a difference. What they did discover, though, was that because the right and left hemispheres were no longer communicating, there actually seemed to be, there's pretty good evidence for the fact that there are now two islands of consciousness, almost like conjoined twins, sharing a body.
Right.
And what's interesting is in most patients, most people, the left hemisphere is responsible for speech and language, and the right hemisphere doesn't have those capabilities. And so when you talk to these patients, you'll ask them questions about what they see, what they feel, what their preferences are, and they will answer. But what you realize is it's the left hemisphere that's answering, because the left hemisphere has control of the language and the verbal speaking abilities, and that they discovered that the right hemisphere often had a different answer, different opinions, different feelings. And separate from that, they were able to interrogate the hemispheres separately because the right and left visual fields go to the opposite hemisphere. So they could give stimuli in experiments they were running to just the right or left hemisphere, and then solicit answers back. They realized that for the right hemisphere, they could ask the person to point to cards on a table with their left hand, because the right hemisphere controls the left hand.
Right.
So when the left hand is answering, or the left hand could draw a picture of the answer they want to give, that was communicating what the right hemisphere was experiencing. But the verbal answer would be the left hemisphere. And so what's incredibly interesting about this real world situation is you can be in the presence of someone who seems like everyone else, and you're talking to them, and yet there's another center of consciousness in that person's body that is having at least a slightly different experience. And so the question I think this really raises, that very few people have yet to grapple with, is, that person would rightfully say, if the stimulus is, a red apple is being shown to the right hemisphere, you ask the person, did you see the red apple? They say, no, there's no red apple. They really didn't see a red apple. But a red apple was seen. There is a brain there that brought the vision of a red apple into existence. And so the question is it possible that there are many systems like this within our own bodies, within our own brains, that just aren't entering our stream of memory and what I call me, that I'm aware of and that I can report back to you? I was actually thinking about when I picked Sam. I picked up my husband from a medical procedure once, and he'd been given propofol or something, and he there was a period of time where it wiped out his memory, right? And I was thinking, I was there for all the things that he didn't remember later. But if he'd just been lying there in the recovery room alone and had some idea for, you can make up anything. Say he had an idea for a trip he wants to take. Later, that period of time for him is gone. I can tell you for sure that everything we talked about in a certain window was completely gone from his story of his life. The question is, how many things are happening like that in the universe, where conscious experiences come in and out of being without entering any stream of memory, because they're not part of a system of memory. The other thing is that we assume that consciousness, so this gets back to my work with neuroscientists and how I started thinking about these things. We feel that consciousness is related to all of these complex thought processes, all these decisions, but the truth is we only have access to those things and we are conscious. And so we've always assumed and didn't quite realize it was an assumption that consciousness is required and related to and about all of these things that we report on and we experience, and we don't have evidence of them being anywhere else, and so they're not there. But it really is an assumption. Consciousness could be, the sense of felt experience could be a really basic function in nature, and we wouldn't expect anything to look different. We really have made this assumption based on no evidence, really, that consciousness is related to decision-making and awareness. And so the evolutionary argument, as you were starting to get to, comes out of that assumption as well. And I actually think that falls apart when you look at it.
Yeah, I think this is an example that you give in the book, but we essentially ascribe a lot of causality to consciousness.
Yes.
Right. So I think the example that you gave in the book was, putting your hand on a hot skillet or something.
Yep.
That one would want to avoid.
Yeah.
But
or
just
encountering a bear in the wilderness or mountain lion.
Yeah. And the intuition there is we consciously recognize the threat or the pain, and then we adopt a certain behavior based upon that threat or that pain.
Or the strength of our reaction is stronger because we felt it. We felt the fear. We felt the heat.
Yeah.
And therefore, we
overlaid
evolved this other function of consciousness because we did so much better at saving ourselves when we could feel it.
That's true. And yes, a lot of these instruments are serve this biological imperative, but that biological imperative is so deeply wired that the response is actually coming kind of from a deeper biological level prior to its projection in consciousness. So we essentially, we're not really removing our hand from the hot skillet because we've recognized, oh my God, it hurts so much, and now I've got to go get some ice and all that kind of stuff. It's actually, that's
at the very
secondary.
It's at the tail end of a lot of processing that the brain is doing. Yeah.
The other aspect of what you just said about memory, I think is pretty fascinating, because when I try to unpack how memory is formed, and I generally consider memory stories that we're telling ourselves about ourselves in the present moment that we essentially fabricate, because memory is pretty mangy. It's like we can have
you can talk about memory on different levels, because like a Venus flytrap has a form of memory. There's like a holding on to information for later use, and that's a much more rudimentary.
True. But just as it pertains to consciousness versus the contents of consciousness. And this also kind of speaks to how we scaffold our identity and sense of self. We tend to create memory often through stacking the contents of consciousness like little cheese singles, or whatever, giant
that's a good visual,
skyscraper of cheese singles, like these minuscule slices of space-time on top of each other, right? Until now we've created the skyscraper of self.
That's right.
But if you were to consider consciousness from a more kind of Eastern perspective, in which really consciousness is this field of awareness in which the contents actually emerges, in which the phenomenal world, thoughts, emotions, feelings arise and subside, and we can attach to them and identify with them or just wave at them, depending how evolved we are. But that consciousness is, kind of where I'm going with this is it's a different approach to its foundational nature, where I've often kind of thought about it like with the disco ball analogy. This is sometimes used in in rudimentary Hinduism to understand the nature of Brahman, but like that you're in a nightclub and you see scattered splotches of light, right, all across. But that's really actually just being projected from one central source. And that to finish that analogy, as mangy as it might be, that one central source is actually one unified consciousness. And we are, individual modifications kind of flittering about the outside of that. And, this is part of enlightenment or samadhi or whatever, essentially integrated consciousness, or really connecting back to that ultimate unity, that Brahman. And so, I guess my question there is that in that sense of kind of Eastern mysticism, is consciousness like this field that sits behind everything else, and that we as organisms are sensitive, and just the way cells have like little receptors on, they have insulin receptors and serotonin receptors or whatever, we actually just that the locus of consciousness is not crouching somewhere here behind the eyes. We are just like a radar system for a bigger unified consciousness that sits out there, and we kind of just tap into it, and then it's coterminous with death, and then that's it. Help me.
Okay.
There's a lot there. There's a big word salad.
I mean, I can do is share with you how I think about this now. And, again, a lot of my work has been rather than moving forward with the assumption that consciousness emerges at some point, what if not only does it go deeper in nature than the sciences have previously assumed, but what if it is fundamental? And I spent many years now, not necessarily believing that, but getting very curious about what if the sciences began with this other assumption, that it's fundamental. How do we look at different phenomena in the world? And a couple of things also, are there scientific discoveries that really rule out this assumption? And I was very interested in being talked out of this idea because I'm not interested in wasting my time. And I'm also interested in the truth. I'm very science-minded, and I really want to understand to the best of my ability, and I want human beings in the future to the best of humanity's ability understand as much as we actually can about the circumstance we're in and the universe. So if consciousness is fundamental, is kind of how I begin every question and every investigation. Yes, what does that mean for kind of the universe in its totality? Actually, one thing I will say is whether or not consciousness is fundamental, I think the description you gave of oneness is true of the universe anyway, and I think science is clearly moving us to that view of things. And so whatever the universe is, whatever quantum mechanics is telling us about the state of matter and all the things we clearly don't understand from our human perspective, it is all one thing. And there aren't really pieces, and it's really all process, and it's really all interaction. So I think there's some, for people who find kind of spiritual comfort in that, I think you can have comfort in that no matter what. If consciousness is fundamental, so there are a couple things I want to say here. One is part of the way you were describing kind of a field and then tapping into, I would say is not really, it's not the way I see it, and I think it's probably not a correct view, because I think that kind of smuggles in the illusion of self, which we haven't started to talk about yet, but I feel like your audience is somewhat familiar. So again, whether or not consciousness is fundamental, we don't have selves. The self is truly an illusion, at the level of neuroscience, at the level of our experience. Sure. I can talk about a little bit more about what I mean by that. There's obviously a phenomenon in nature that we can refer to as a self. There's a historical
biography to Annaka. She woke up one place,
and
she
my
drove
physical
here.
boundaries and all these ways we can. But the example I've been giving more and more recently is, we can talk about waves, ocean waves, and we can give it a name, wave, and we know exactly what we're talking about, and we can point to them. But we're not under the illusion that that waves are concrete things that you can hold on to. They're processes in nature. And we kind of think about them as things, and we can label them as things, but they're ongoing, ever-changing processes in nature, and we understand now that that is what the brain is as well. Yeah. And so each new experience I have is generated anew in each moment. It is just this endless cycle of waves, essentially. And so this feeling that we're these solid entities that kind of move through time, that have these experiences, is a false way of looking at things at a more fundamental level. Mm-hmm. So if consciousness is fundamental, what I mean by that is that it is actually what the universe is. It's what everything we perceive and experience is at bottom. That there's really nothing but conscious experience. And so we're kind of led to believe that there are these things out there, concrete things out there in the way we perceive them to be, because there's a way in which all conscious experiences interact and shape one another. One thing I think that's really helpful to think about here is the way, our brains kind of develop over time. Actually, I'll just give another example of seeing, if we see the color blue and don't understand scientifically what it means for the light waves to be bouncing off something, and some light waves get absorbed by that object and others bounce off, and it's the blue wavelength that enters my retina, and so on. I am left with this feeling that blue exists out there. And I can get that confirmation from you, because you can say, yes, it's blue, and we all agree this is blue.
Sort of an intersubjective.
And it's clearly out there. We can touch it, we can interact with it, it's there.
It might not be objectively true, but intersubjectively we can agree.
Yes, but I even mean when we didn't understand the science, and we actually, you can see why we thought that was the case.
True.
So physicists are now at the point where they're basically all in agreement that space is an emergent property, that it's not fundamental. And so this is one thing I've been thinking a lot about lately, is what is our perception of space actually a perception of? And since we know it's not fundamental, it is not actually the thing we're perceiving in the same way that there isn't blue out there that we're perceiving. It's the way our brain maps out light waves for us, and a variety of other things. And so we've been convinced that space is a fundamental thing in the universe. We're clearly in it. We navigate it. We know, if there's anything we know space. But it turns out space is not fundamental. And so what is it that our brains are mapping for us that we have turned into this idea of space? It's something else that's not space the way we perceive it. I think we are perceiving some structure of the universe, clearly. That was the other thing I was going to say, is that the universe clearly has structure to it, right? And so the question that I became really interested in, and that I was kind of left with at the end of all of this exploration, was if consciousness is fundamental, why does it have the structure it has? And what does that mean? Because there's something dual about that, the fact that there's consciousness, and that's what it is at bottom. But it takes on these different forms. And we can kind of map those forms in a physical way. But if consciousness is fundamental, then all the physical things that we understand, that we perceive as human beings, but that also we can perceive with instruments, that physics is mapping out, that the mathematics explains, that's all structure of conscious experiences arising and passing away. And why is it that consciousness has this structure, and what is that structure, and how can we understand it better? But I think a lot of the new theories of quantum gravity and the ways we are having a hard time getting our minds around what quantum mechanics is telling us, I think are actually a little easier to digest and understand if we view consciousness as fundamental. A lot of these things make more sense when it's the experience that's at the bottom rather than the physical thing that we keep trying to find the bottom of.
Yeah. Well, every effort to find the fundamental building blocks of the universe seems just to lead to another attempt to do it as instruments. It's almost the better the instruments that we develop, the more that we find.
More questions.
Right. So,
yes. Well, and what we find is a universe is behavior that makes no sense.
Yeah.
I mean, when you get to non-locality and these things that come out, that we're no longer talking about a world we understand. We don't know how to make sense of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the illusion of self is helpful there sometimes because it actually can provide a window into something greater and cosmological there of like actually understanding yourself as organic process and not as a fixed thing.
Yes.
I often use the like a Bic lighter sort of as a good visual for it. So, if I like ignite the flame, we recognize that flame by its form, right? And, there's obviously a chemical reaction happening with oxygen in the air and butane or whatever the fuel source is. But we would never think that form is fixed, right? We know that all
Same
of the
collection
molecules...
of atoms the next time you do it.
Yeah, it's just all the molecules are moving downstream, if
That's
you
right.
will.
Yes.
And I can recognize you tomorrow
Yes.
and probably the next day by your form.
Right.
And you even are actually anchored to your own self-identity through that physical continuity, right?
Yes.
But of course, I find...
And mental continuity.
And psychological continuity, for sure.
Yeah.
But that, of course, really, I mean, we can just pick up a photo album and look at Annaka as like a cherubic little angelic kid, and then as a, pimply teenager or whatever, and be disabused of this idea that you are anything but evolving process. You are just, I recognize you by your form, but you're completely impermanent and transient. And then, we start to open up the hood of your organism and look into your colon and see, well, not that we would do that on this show, but...
even more interestingly, the brain. I mean, it's fascinating to see what happens during brain surgery.
Yeah.
And the types of things that people can experience when you turn on electrodes when they're connected to certain parts of the brain and others. I mean, just suddenly your experience completely changes. Yeah.
Yeah, and that matter stops. That matter is not this kind of stable, reliable, fixed thing.
That there's nothing actually stable. Yeah. Neuroscientists have now kind of uncovered something very interesting called change blindness. And so we're aware of it. Many people are aware of the work in the visual field of change blindness. So you're looking at a photo, and then suddenly there's a monkey on the basketball court, and you don't notice from one slice to the next. But we also have something similar in our memory, and so we kind of have a built-in change blindness to how different we actually feel in different moments. And so it also accentuates this experience of being a solid thing that moves through.
Yeah. It's actually quite fascinating that we tend to want very sharp, acute memory, but we're also very, very happy, whether we actually recognize it or not to have certain memories. And our brain seems to collate that pretty well. Like, I don't care at all where I parked at the Vons, right? I'm happy to forget that. This is completely non-consequential. Right. But I don't want to forget my anniversary, though I probably will. But maybe this podcast will help me. But, it is quite interesting that we do seem to have this kind of collating mechanism in terms of the kind of primacy of certain memories over others.
Yes.
And then there's this other component of consciousness that seems to be quite confounding, where, it appears that we can shine the spotlight of our consciousness onto a particular thing, and then also be unaware of the kind of broader kind of quote unquote floodlight consciousness. So. And sometimes I think about this in terms of, and I'm sure people can relate to this, where someone brings someone up in conversation and you cannot remember that person's name, but you know what that name is not. Right?
Sure.
So it's not Frank, and it's not Bob, and it's not all of these other things. But you can't quite shine your consciousness, the spotlight of it, onto
where you
it.
Want to.
Where you want to.
Yeah.
And then generally you're walking through the woods and from under the crust of consciousness, yes. Bradley's name pops in.
Right, yes, or 3 a.m. you wake up and remember the name.
Yeah, and so where I'm getting here is that in near-death experiences, and I've heard many people describe this, people often report this kind of floodlight consciousness, that their spotlight consciousness seems to be coterminous with the cessation of brain function and cardiac function, et cetera, but that on the other side of this glorious life, that there is this floodlight that goes on. You have any intuition about that?
Well, so I talk a lot about psychedelic experiences in my work. I'm very interested in them for a variety of reasons. I think they're related to this phenomenon. So one thing I would say is that clearly as the brain develops over the years, there's this pruning that happens. And it's very useful for survival and for being a human being. But to the extent that our perceptions are misleading us about the underlying reality, they become more and more distorting of the underlying reality, I think. And so for the same reason we see blue and think blue is out there, an infant or, very young brain has not yet made those grooves of distinctions and beliefs about what all of these perceptions mean. And so one of the reasons I think psychedelics are so useful, and also meditation actually, is because they kind of undo some of that pruning. And connections are now being made across the brain that have been trimmed down that we usually, there's not, in our normal waking everyday life, we just don't really have access to. And so I think, one thing that is totally clear, I think that there's a range of assumptions we might make or conclusions we might draw from these experiences. And I think the further out they go, the less committed to them I am, and the more they start to trail into, unscientific New Age territory that, may or may not be onto something. But I like to stay in,
they're fun,
calling what we know, and what we don't know, what we don't know. I think what we know and what is incredibly useful and always useful for scientists is challenging our intuitions, shaking up our intuitions so that we can think creatively about things that our evolved sense of being have made it hard to see. It's kind of narrowed our focus. So I think psychedelics are incredibly useful for that. They're also useful for having such a drastically different experience of being a human brain that it makes you realize how many other types of conscious experiences are possible just within the human brain. Forget about where else we might find it in nature. It enables us to viscerally understand that the way we usually walk through the world is not the only way to experience the world.
Yeah. Totally. I totally agree.
And I think near-death experiences are similar.
Yeah.
In that they're doing that. I don't know how much they're giving a clearer view of the underlying reality. I also think there's something suspect or something we can't totally rely on how we then interpret those experiences when we're back in our everyday brains. And I think this way about psychedelics too, right? I've had so many experiences that I really find impossible to describe, and I often know someone else has had them because they're doing the same dance I'm doing. They're using similar words, but none of the words are right. And this comes back to communication. One thing that's very interesting to me about communication is we're limited by our shared conscious experiences. So if I'm trying to explain to someone who was born deaf what the middle E, what is it called on the piano?
Middle C.
Middle C. If I'm trying to explain to someone, who's never heard before what middle C on the piano sounds like, there are all kinds of analogies. We can talk about vibrations, but the experience of hearing middle C, if someone hasn't had it, there's nothing you can say. There is no way to communicate. You have to have the shared experience plus the ability to point to the shared experience. And so when human beings have experiences that are unusual or that are unlike ones that we have language for, language fails us in those circumstances.
Yeah.
This relates to where I think science could be headed, and is what I talk about in the last chapter of my documentary series called The Future of Science. And this is the idea of experimenting with sharing intuitions, sharing felt experiences from human to human. And who knows if this is something we can do. We're already starting to get there with some of the neuroscience. David Eagleman has done some of this work and actually spoke to a participant in a study where they gave participants an experience of magnetic north. So these are experiments called sensory addition.
With the belt?
Yes.
Yeah, that's
So
crazy.
The brain can actually adapt to different signals. So we have eyes and ears and all the rest, but you can actually have other signals received by the body and the brain, and then have the brain learn to interpret them, and then suddenly you have a visceral sense in the same way we have a visual sense of other signals that we don't normally perceive. So I think this work is going to move forward, and I think it's incredibly interesting. But I think, we talked about my husband losing memory, or me being, you see a picture of me when I'm whatever age, 5 years old, and I'm obviously a completely different human, different brain now, in almost every sense of the word. And I feel a connection to that 5-year-old girl through memory. And it's the memory of the felt experiences that make that connection. And what I find really interesting is the way, and this again is kind of like breaking the way we normally think about things, but it's pretty interesting that this conscious experience I'm having right now is affected by a conscious experience that this 5-year-old girl had, right? It's influencing the experience now through memory.
Cause, yeah.
And I can kind of look back on it and in some sense see the world as it was seen in that moment in space and time. But I can't do that with you. And that's really just the physical limitation. And so there's no real reason why I couldn't have an experience of making my daughter's lunch this morning. It's like I know what it was like to sit there. I kind of have that memory. That was me. And then having an experience of being you, writing something in your notebook later, if there's some way we could put, at bottom, it's this trail of memory. And so if there's a future scientific method by which I could have a memory of being me, of the 5-year-old, me yesterday, and Jeff writing in his notebook, that would actually, I think, give us a better sense, a truer sense of the underlying reality, in that we're not these separate selves.
Well, okay. That's really, that's fascinating. I mean, if you talk about the use of psychedelics, for example, in this kind of synaptoblastic framework, right?
Yeah.
But it's also an opening of the aperture of your attention to and a sort of deep trust, really, and lack of self-obsession. And I think of kind of the opposite experience, which is where we live most days, kind of dull care, if you will.
Yeah.
I sometimes think about this in terms of like my pants. Like I only actually notice my pants when they're tight.
Right.
Yeah. And I only really notice myself when I'm tight.
Right.
And,
that's interesting.
There are periods where that's accentuated. You're in turbulence on an airplane, or you're, get cut off in traffic. And what does that feel like? It feels like a flexing of your muscles in tightness. Yeah. Or someone says, work harder. You're not working hard. I'm tight, right? Yeah. And when you're that way, and you could attribute that to sort of sympathetic overload or amygdala hijack or the activation of your sympathetic nervous system, et cetera, with the concomitant, neuromodulators and hormones and stress hormones and cortisol, et cetera, that essentially really start to underwrite a sense of self, a closing of the aperture of your attention, a self-obsession, a distrust of the world around you. Yeah. Oftentimes, that was very adaptive.
Well, I was just going to say, all of this is evolutionarily advantageous.
Yeah, on the Serengeti, of East Africa, not on the Serengeti of Facebook, but yeah, sure.
But even in some circumstances, I mean, it is evolutionarily,
That's true.
for the most part, advantageous. And what's interesting to me about meditation, actually, and I had this conversation with a few people in my series, meditation is a practice that goes against our evolutionary drives and functions. It's part of the reason why it's so hard to do.
Yeah.
And if you didn't stop doing it, you would die, right? I mean, the idea is to just experience and to feel, and you feel hunger, but you don't go get the food, and you feel, you're just witnessing, and that is not a good way to survive.
Yeah. Well, and then I think of the opposite experience that we can get sometimes through deep creative immersion or through collective enterprise, like when it could be around a dinner table, but it also could be some collective philanthropic enterprise, a walk in nature, but certainly accentuated into sort of a peak experience in connection with psychedelics, right?
Yeah, right.
Which is this sort of opposite of that kind of tightening up.
Yes.
Which is that great
Expansive,
opening and expansion
Yeah.
and a taste into kind of integrated consciousness, right? A taste into what it might be like to be Annaka, maybe.
Yes.
And I think that ability could be enhanced through science, through kind of a greater experience, maybe clinical experience of psychedelic application. So
yeah, I think it has many interesting applications, many of which I think would increase human well-being and psychology and spirituality. And also science. One thing I've been thinking a lot about is if scientists could share their intuitions in the form of an intuition. Because we're limited by, all scientific breakthroughs come from a scientist having an intuition first. They understand something at a visceral level, and then they have to convert that into mathematics and physics and language, and it takes decades usually to get that intuition put into action. And if you could just implant that intuition in your 10 colleagues, you'd all have that same feeling. Yeah.
And it's so interesting that those intuitions often emerge in that kind of theta liminal state.
Yeah.
I think Einstein and Edison, they had, the balls that they used to hold in their hand, right? And they would go into this sort of like non-sleep, deep rest, theta liminal state until one of them would hit the ground and then they'd wake up, right? And they'd wake up maybe with, the theory of relativity.
Because it's helpful to kind of drop.
Well, there's like pratyahara, for example, that sort of removal of the senses, which is kind of baked into some yoga
because they're giving us all these illusions, and so it's helpful for our creativity, and science I see as a very creative endeavor.
I have one kind of last question, a couple of last questions. One, so I asked AI in preparation for talking to you. I asked Chat, "Are you conscious?" Have you ever done that?
No. That's a great idea.
Yeah, because
I'm sure people have, but no, this is the first time hearing of someone doing it.
And it was very funny. The answer was so colloquial. It was like, to be honest, no. I mean, I can have this conversation with you. I can break down a lot of scientific processes. I know a lot about neuroscience, but actually, Jeff, I'm sorry, no one's really home.
Interesting.
It was actually kind of sweet.
That's sweet and kind of sad.
Yeah. But
I would love the follow-up question. How do you know?
Well, okay. To be continued. It's in my thread there. But what are your feelings there with regards to consciousness and AI?
Yeah, I feel like I never have a great answer to this because for some reason I don't find it that interesting, but I'm pretty sure I know why. And it's because I spend all of my time thinking about this stuff in the context of consciousness being fundamental. And if consciousness is fundamental, every system in nature is as fascinating to me as every other. And actually the things that are less human-like are more interesting to me. And so if consciousness is fundamental, AI is already conscious. It always was. Everything that makes up all of our computers, like it's just nothing but conscious experiences. It's, what the reality is. One thing that I think is disturbing and very useful for us to think about, I don't know what we can do about it, but whether or not consciousness is fundamental, but especially if it is, we are on the road to making systems whose external behavior matches our own or matches our cats or other conscious creatures. We have a pretty good sense, feel pain, feel things that we understand. If consciousness is fundamental, I think that the way the matter is configured has to be related to the experiences that are generated or that are, associated with that what we are perceiving to be matter. That AI we're going to have a very tricky situation that we've never faced before, which is behavior that matches other behavior in the world that can tell us something about the conscious experience. Where I think the conscious experience is likely to be vastly different, completely unrecognizable to us on the inside. Some kind of computer AI that can behave the way a human behaves is made of very different stuff and configured very differently, and so therefore likely has a very, very different experience on the inside. And how we will figure out how to navigate a world where our intuitions are strongly driving a sense that things are very different than they actually are. I don't know where that. But I don't think so much about AI only because I think I'm so interested in the idea that consciousness is fundamental, and I do all of my thinking in that space, and so I'm just interested in what vastly different systems, what those experiences are like, how the structure of the universe dictates the experiences that are arising, those types of things.
Yeah. Okay. Last question. It's a little parallel, I think, to kind of where you spend most of your time thinking. But it relates to qualia and subjective experience, specifically in a very anthropocentric way.
Okay.
So, yes, there is this subjective experience to what it is, this kind of experience of what it's like to be Jeff. And in many ways it's absolutely wonderful, like that we get to sit here together and find words as vessels for thoughts and emotions such that we can actually share them and enjoy it. And also a meta level that we can know that we enjoy it,
right,
which is a whole other thing.
Yes.
It's like one thing to be happy, it's another thing to know that you're happy. And that is what I would call the sunny side of human consciousness.
Yeah.
I wonder if you think that the kind of shady side of human consciousness has to do with mortality awareness, because I don't know of any other sentient being or organism that is aware of its own ultimate demise. And I wonder if you've spent...
How much of our suffering comes from that.
Yeah. And I wonder if you've kind of thought about that at all, or kind of this where we are in the story of evolutionary biology, that by some fortuitous combination of atoms in our brain, we are here now with this wonderful sense of qualia, but the other side of that is like, I know I'm going to die and my family's going to die.
That's an interesting question that I could take a lot of different ways. So, one thing is I spend a lot of time, and always have spent a lot of time, focused on human suffering. And I think, what I've kind of come to realize through all of this work, and especially during the 5 years of working on this documentary series, that as we were talking about kind of evolutionary drives being the opposite of what you're doing with your mind in meditation, that there's something about life that is kind of destined for suffering. Even creatures that don't know they're going to die, right? There's something about, even at the level of the cell, maintaining a form, having to fight entropy. It takes energy, it takes work, it's always in danger of failing. And so if the goal is to keep this thing going, it's just by definition hard work. There's competition. There's, when you get to the animal level, there's pain and disease and, all kinds of suffering without even having a true understanding or awareness of death. We were talking about our cats hunting birds, how cute they look, but that they're really just murderers.
They're just vicious
Yeah.
under that fluffy veneer.
Right. And so I think there's a lot of suffering baked in, even before you get to the awareness of death and the acceptance of the fact that everything that you love is also, everything is impermanent. When I first started seriously considering that consciousness is fundamental, I actually had kind of a sinking feeling because of my awareness and connection to human suffering. I just immediately got concerned that there's so much more suffering in the universe if there's that much more consciousness. There's just that much more capacity for suffering. And so I did not like the conclusion for a while. There's another side to that, though, which is, especially as it relates to death, that we really aren't these individual selves, and there is just kind of an ongoing flux of ocean waves, for lack of a better analogy. And so I think there is something kind of comforting about that. I don't know, maybe comforting is the wrong word. There's something that feels deeply true and kind of transcends all of the things that all of the types of thoughts that cause us suffering like that, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, to really not just kind of cognitively grok this idea that we will be eventually subsumed into the great ocean and no longer identify as the wave.
Yeah.
To truly actually feel at ease with that, that's a whole nother chapter.
Yeah.
I mean, I can forgive people cognitively, but it takes a long time for it to get down here.
Yeah.
And so I feel kind of that same way about death. And like I can, empirically kind of understand that all of the atoms of hydrogen and carbon and nitrogen, phosphorus and calcium and all that good juicy stuff will go back and make some wonderful compost somewhere and
but
move on.
But if consciousness is fundamental, there's a little bit of a deeper realization than that even. And actually, I think this realization can be had also just in this life. I don't know if this analogy will help. I was thinking about it actually on the way here that, if you think about that period of time where I picked up my husband, we had this whole conversation, completely wiped from his memory, right? Let's say it was a wonderful, loving...
This might be selective, actually, but I'll give him enough credit just for this.
Oh, we've had it a few times. He actually talked about it on his podcast. It's very funny, the story he tells, because he was so sure he'd remember. I'm telling him he's not going to remember, and then he told me to give him a statement for him to remember, like a test. He was like, give me a test. I was like, you don't understand. This whole thing is the test. You're not going to remember. I don't need to say anything. You're not going to remember this. This is happening.
Sounds like my colonoscopy. But
yes, that's what it was.
Okay.
So my point is that let's say we had, a very meaningful moment or embrace or, some moment of extreme love in that period of time that gets wiped from his memory, right? Later, I can tell him that it happened and he can feel good about the fact that happened. And one thing that I was just kind of playing with is the idea that he would be happier that he had that experience that does not exist for him in any shape or form now in the present moment, than that someone else had that experience. It kind of turns your perspective so that you can see how ultimately everything is all about conscious experiences coming into and out of existence. And there was no him to have the experience. That experience came into being and went away. And so this I was thinking about in terms of compassion. Like when you think about it in that way, there's no reason I should be happier that I had a certain experience than that you had a certain experience, that you can feel for someone else's experiences as if it's your own when you understand that all that's actually happening in the universe is conscious experiences are coming in and out of being. And I think that's kind of where the idea of one mind comes from, although I don't love that phrasing because I think then it's just a big self. And I don't think the self should be anywhere. I've sometimes use the analogy of a pot of boiling water, where water is consciousness and the bubbles are kind of just these endlessly fluctuating experiences that come into and out of being. And so I think if we think of the universe on the whole as ultimately that is what it is, then even conscious experiences, there's no ownership of any of them. Right. I can't own the experiences I had when I was a child any more than Sam can own that experience that he doesn't remember, or that they're just experiences. They're not happening to anyone. There's no one mind for them to happen to. They just come and go.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most difficult aspects of this conversation for anyone.
Yeah.
That consciousness does not require a self.
Subject.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because we're so moored to that.
Yeah.
Right.
Another reason why psychedelics, I think, are so helpful.
Yeah.
Because you can completely drop that illusion.
And I think to kind of put the proverbial bow on it, this is why this topic is worth excavating. I mean, I think obviously there's kind of this greater epistemological, ontological exploration that we all love to kind of probe and poke at.
Yeah.
But there is sort of a very deeply kind of human aspect to it, where, this idea of like identifying someone else's suffering as your own.
Yeah.
Or experiencing joy just for someone else's joy.
Yeah. And that actually makes more sense. That's closer to the truth, even than the way we experience it.
Yeah. And I think, and I want to ask you kind of, why do you spend your time thinking about it? Why is this important? Why is the excavation of consciousness important?
Yeah. I think you just answered. For all of those reasons, also, one of which is that I don't seem to have any control over it. I feel so lucky that I get to spend my time. This is what I enjoy thinking about. And so I've somehow turned it into a career, which is, I don't quite know how I did that, but I feel very lucky that that the universe let me carve that path, because it is what I enjoy thinking about. And I think part of it is just, the scientific curiosity of wanting to understand the universe better. And part of it is that I find that at least the truths that we've uncovered so far in the sciences and in contemplative endeavors, the truths are actually more satisfying and more conducive to well-being. And so, it kind of just gives us another reason to want to continue to seek truth. Yeah.
Well, Annaka, we feel lucky, too, that you found your path here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for all your work, and I loved listening, and thanks for being my hiking partner.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a great conversation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hopefully to be continued.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hey, thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then I think you'll love this one too.